Changing sex education in Missouri. Here's a question. Should consent and harassment be included in the lessons along with the birds and the bees? Also, roads and bridges cost dollars and cents, so how do we pay for what's needed today and tomorrow? Are you willing to pay more at the pump? And is it even possible to agree to disagree these days? It seems like our political differences make us mortal enemies anymore. Can we change that? That's all just ahead on Across the Aisle. We don't agree on everything. That's the point. I'm Mike Ferguson. Welcome to Across the Aisle, where you're supposed to hear something that you don't like. I mean, come on, that's the fun part. So let's meet this week's panel of political pontificators. You hear him every week on FM NewsTalk 97.1, Chris Arps. Also, she is the fearless leader of Lindenwood University's College Democrats, Jessie Basler. When he is not suiting up for Lindenwood University's hockey team, he is trying to make America great again. From LU's College Republicans, Skyler Budman, and shaping the next generation with knowledge of the past in hopes of helping them make sense of the present, Lindenwood University history professor Don Heidenreich. So let's get started with talking to each other. The Trump versus Hillary election did not invent shouting matches and protests and even violence along the campaign trail, but it feels like we may have perfected it. Is that just the new normal? Don, I'm going to start with you. Let's look at this from a historical perspective. It feels like we almost broke new ground with vulgarities and with hatred and with shouting matches. Did we? How do we compare to what's happened in the past?
Well, one thing I've told my colleagues, and we've talked about this, is that frankly, our current politicians, compared to the politicians particularly of the later 18th and 19th century, were pikers. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, they'd wipe the floor with these guys as far as knowing how to run a really down and dirty election. Okay, so no, I don't think we've broken any new ground. I'm not even sure we've even hit the top. But there have been periods. This is one of those things that it's cyclical, really, for Americans. Sometimes these cycles are long, sometimes they're short, depending upon what's going on. Yeah, so we had the early republic, we have before the Civil War, you see this again right after the Civil War, you see it for a bit in the early 20th century, and of course now we're really kind of deeply into this. Admittedly, I grew up in an era of real political cooperation where I was able, when working in politics, I actually worked with people on the other side, from the other party without any problem. We got along, we were friends. And that is something I think that ultimately we'll see again. We need to understand, though, that in the end, when you're in that moment, it feels like everything's coming apart. But we really have a long history of coming out the other end.
Now, Skyler, let me ask you this. That sounds like a fairy tale world to first or second time voters. And college campuses have been ground zero for a lot of the extreme disagreement and shouting and even violence for people that, you know, some groups didn't want to hear from. When you look at younger voters, like you, like Jessie, it may feel like this is the worst time ever. When people disagree, what is it that takes, especially young people, but older ones too, what is it that takes people to that next level of just hatred outside of disagreement, do you think?
Well, I think the way it stands right now, we have people who, they see things in a very black and white way. You have people who are so set in their beliefs and they feel almost weakness coming towards the other side. And I think what we need to remind people and what people need to understand is that it's not necessarily about getting your way. It's about coming to the same end goal. And so on college campuses and even in politics, there needs to be compromise all the time to make anything happen. And so we see people, and they're so set in what they actually believe is the right way of doing things, that they lose sight of what they actually want to accomplish at the end.
Jessie, let me ask you this. It seems like we're just evolving into almost a tribalism mindset. Everybody says what Skyler just said. We're all here. We have different ideas on what's best for the country or best for the state or best for our city, whatever the level of government we're talking about. But it's really an all or nothing mindset for a lot of people. And that's not unique to Democrats. That's not unique to Republicans. But it is something we see all the time. Elections are competitions. How do we come back together after the competition and say, good game, let's work together now?
I think the reason people are so fired up about these political campaigns and things is that it's not just politics, it's not just policy, we're shaping the world we live in. And if you have those set in your moral standards, it's very impassionate to you because that's the life you're trying to live and set for the next generations. I think the best way to overcome those issues is solidarity, understanding that someone might have a different opinion than you and it might really oppress your personal morals, but understanding that there is no right or wrong when it comes to opinions. People are going to have their opinions and their different beliefs, but we're very quick to close in on what their secret agenda is and things like that, especially if they're from a different political leaning than we are. We constantly say, well, you're saying that because you were raised that way, or you have this belief, or you don't support this group of marginalized people. And instead of attacking, I think we need to step back and focus on listening, actively understanding where that opinion is coming from and what it means and how we could comparatively work together to find a compromise and work something forward.
Chris Arps, listening is one thing that every leader says that they need to do. We all want them to do it, but it seems like all politics isn't local, all politics is personal, and it's always a matter of beating down the opponent, because it seems to me, and you've worked on campaigns, I've worked on campaigns, is that part of the strategy is to disgust the supporters of the other side so they don't show up to vote, and that's just a reality of politics.
Well, and that's been part of the game since the beginning of politics. You know, I have to agree with the professor a little bit about, you know, discourse in American politics. It's always been kind of rough. But I think with the advent of the internet and all of these citizen journalists, I think that's what has kind of exacerbated it and has made the discourse even more coarser. I think it really started getting bad when Bill Clinton was running for president and became president. I think there were many on the right that couldn't believe a person that did drugs and did the things he did became president of the United States. And I think that kind of infected the whole culture of politics, so that whenever a political party gets in power, the Democrats have to do what the Republicans did to them and vice versa. You know, when we had on the radio show Senator Tim Scott and Senator Langford of Oklahoma. Now, they're both Republicans, but they have an initiative they came up with called Solution Sunday. And what that is you invite someone from the opposite race over to your home for dinner. And you're not talking about politics or anything else. You're just breaking bread. And I think we have to get to that point that we may disagree on politics, but at the end of the day, we can go have a beer and have a dinner at someone's house and leave all that behind.
Now that leads me to the question about identity, not just politics, but identity in culture. It seems like we are looking for things that divide us more. We're political subgroups, we are religious subgroups, we are demographics more than we're just people. And you know what? Liberals do it, conservatives do it. How do we look at people as people? Because it seems to me until we stop looking at people as demographics, none of these things we're talking about are really going to happen anytime soon.
Exactly. So in sociology, we learn that the first thing people recognize is gender, then they notice race, and we're just hardwired to do that. You have to actually want to go past those barriers and understand the person. So I think looking for similarities, that we both work, we both go to school, we both have families and people we care about, and finding those moral grounds that we actually share obligations towards. Instead of dividing us, it's very difficult to not do that, just because anthropologically we are hardwired to do that as humans. Notice the difference, but focus on the similarities to surpass those differences.
Sounds great, but divided, the other guy falls in the campaign, Skyler.
I mean, the way I see it, just kind of going off what Jessie said, at the end of the day, we are all Americans, and if the end goal is what I think it should be, which is to better the country and ensure that my generation and the following generations become better off, more prosperous, I think that we can all agree, or we should all be able to agree, that being an American is what brings us together. Working, going through the things that we go through, the tragedies and all the prosperity we have should motivate us to actually work together and come to solutions. Last
word, Chris Arps?
I was going to say, I think talk radio, and I hate to say that because it's mostly a conservative thing, but I think that has exacerbated and made the discourse even more coarse, because we watch on Fox News or MSNBC, we watch things that correlate with what we believe, and we don't want to hear anything else. And political consultants know that and understand that, and that's what they're going to focus on, getting people's emotions and anger ginned up to get votes.
Well, we're about 10 minutes away from talking about sex. Well, or at least talking about what high school students should talk about when talking about sex. Should Missouri add discussions of consent and harassment to the already awkward discussions? That's just a little bit later on. Just ahead, could pain at the pump be worth it? It might be time to raise the tax on gasoline. Find out what the panel thinks of that in about 1 minute right here on Across the Aisle. Let's talk about sex. Sort of. And in about 8 minutes. I'm Mike Ferguson. Thank you for watching Across the Aisle. But before that, let's talk about a less sexy subject, but just as important. Raising the taxes on gasoline. The Missouri Department of Transportation says it doesn't have enough money to maintain our highways and our other infrastructure, and officials warn that our roadways may crumble, our bridges may fall, and we may not keep up with the transportation and technology needs of tomorrow. So, Skyler, I'm going to start with you. Are you willing to pay another 10 cents a gallon at the pump if it means that we keep the highways built or we expand for what's ahead?
I think infrastructure is obviously important. I think the extra 10 cents, it could be worth it. Coming to taxpayers through actually making a purchase rather than just being taken directly out of their incomes. It's a good way for the government to levy a tax on people. The one thing that I would want to watch out for is gas not only fuels vehicles, but it also fuels the economy. And as we increase gas prices, we have to understand that we will see an increase in other prices as businesses start passing that on to the consumers. Okay, Don, it's interesting with the sales tax. A couple different things. First of all, sales taxes are inherently regressive.
Absolutely.
Secondly, though a gas tax is sort of a user fee. You use the highways more, you pay more. You use it less, you pay less, just by the nature of buying in bulk, so to speak. Is this a good approach? Because for some people, 10 cents a gallon means a lot. If you've got an 18-gallon tank, $1.80 may not sound like a lot, but if you fill up 2 or 3 times a week for low-income Missourians, that can sting a little bit.
The regressive nature is something that would automatically concern me. I understand, though, that it is, you're right, it's a user fee. There have been interesting questions here. What about hybrids? How do you deal with those? How do you deal with bicyclists, of which I'm one, right? People who we ride on the roads. How do you deal with those individuals who are actually using the roads and may not use them as much, and yet they are not necessarily paying the gas tax? So there are other things that could be considered here and need to be considered when you're looking at this. But I suspect that in the long run, because the idea is it goes from the gas tax to building roads and to building bridges, which the federal government did about 5 years ago, did a really nice job of identifying for us the fact that pretty much all the bridges in the country are in trouble. Not quite that bad, but when after the bridge dropped into the Mississippi River a few years ago, they did this big study across the country. They funded figuring out what bridges were bad and then didn't fund actually fixing them.
Baby steps. Baby steps.
It's been years. So, I mean, the acknowledgement of the fact that we have a problem. Now, whether this is the solution, whether there's a 16-cent tax or the 6-cent tax that the Senate committee just recently passed, if it was yesterday or a couple days ago, whatever that is, at least we're now discussing it. And that's the important part right now. We'll discuss it, and hopefully we can come up with a solution.
Chris, Missouri is not, voters have not been friendly to sales tax increases. When you look at the last, say, 8 years or so, sales tax on the ballot has gone down in flames time and time and time again.
As a conservative, this is a tough issue for me because, we're against tax increases. But, Mike, you from being Kansas City and driving to St. Louis back and forth, Highway 70 and our roads are in terrible conditions. And, that looks bad for the state of Missouri, and it hurts productivity and our economy. I would be more favorable, and I used to hate these when I was driving to Oklahoma and Texas and Florida, but I think I would be more amenable to a toll or a toll road, more than a raising of the gas tax. And I think that's more of a user thing.
Yeah, but every cent that gets added onto taxes on gasoline adds to the cost of things being transported on your 18-wheelers or on your delivery vans and things like that. This all adds up at some point, Jessie. Does this hurt low-income Missourians, and should we look at a gas tax or should we look at something else?
I think a gas tax is like a user fee, and I do see the amendability to that issue, because if you are using the roads, you should be paying for their infrastructure, for their upkeep and things like that. And I can understand how the inflation of that gas tax will influence the entire economy, and overall, I think it will directly affect Americans, because that's who is continuously going to the pump to get to work and things like that. I think the cent increase might be a slight sting, but the money has to come from somewhere, and this is the most amendable way we can have it in the bipartisanship that Greetens and his companies are trying to push through. The issue is that gas tax is acceptable by both sides of the aisle currently right now, and while Greetens is a little iffy about it, I think it's one of those ways that we have to find where the money's going to come from in a way we can all agree on, because nothing will happen until we find that comparison.
Professor?
And one of the few problems I have with toll roads, and I'm actually, you drive through Kansas, and frankly, the toll interstates are so much nicer than the non-toll interstates.
Without a doubt.
But the problem is, well, you need the money now for the areas of outback Missouri. And we have it's easy to think of Missouri as, especially if you live in the St. Louis area or the Kansas City area, as urban. But, the vast majority of Missouri is outback. I lived out in Columbia for many years and traveled a lot of those back roads. And I got to tell you, we need money to also take care of those. So in the end, I think, even though I think you could keep a lower gas tax if you added toll roads, and I know a lot of people on the liberal side who said, I have no problem with this. If we needed to do this, that's fine, okay? But how are we going to take care of the Adair County and Howard County and Boone County? And that's where the problem comes in.
So let me ask you this. One of the problems that MoDOT keeps saying is, first of all, they say we haven't raised the gas tax in a long time, but people are getting more miles per gallon when they're driving. Cars are more efficient. You've now got electric cars, which use, frankly, fossil fuel in a different format. So are we getting punished for doing better when it comes to energy efficiency?
That's a good question, Mike. And I guess on the front of it, I guess we are. But, progress is progress, and if we're getting more miles per gallon, then that's a good thing. I don't have a problem with that.
Well, let me ask this, Jesse. The highways of tomorrow, I've had people tell me who are in the department, MoDOT and some others, it's not just going to be a road. It's going to be fiber optics going underneath that road and along the side of that road. That's going to have to do with your connectivity, because we've got driverless cars in the future, whether we like it or not. So when it comes to just maintaining what we've got, that's one thing. But to rebuild, we're talking billions of dollars in our state alone. I mean, man, for billions of dollars, you could buy like one sports stadium and give it to a millionaire.
Exactly. Looking at our country, the way our entire country is connected is by those roads for transportation, for work, for everything we use. And they are going to be more advanced soon, and that money has to be accumulated to bend into that cost and expenses that we're going to have with that. And I think a gas tax is an effective way to do it, but I think there's going to be a lot more money that's needed. The issue is just moving money around in our government and where we're going to actually get it from. Okay,
let me ask you this. So if you've got somebody who lives in one of these counties that the professor just talked about, you know what, they're not good. That highway in Adair County is not going to be on top of the list. I-70 is. I-44 is. I-49 is. That county highway is going to be way down the list, but those people are still going to be taxed. Is that fair?
I mean, the way that you have to look at it is that we have to address the biggest problems, the roads that are facing the most traffic, and we have to cater to as many people as we can. Because when it comes down to any situation, we're never going to be able to address the problem with everybody, but we have to do what's best for the community as a whole. So people are going to be facing this tax, and obviously it's not going to be seen everywhere, but I think that the end goal has to be that we address it and fix a solution for as many people as possible.
Okay, so one way or the other, we're likely going to be paying more taxes at the pump. Well, now let's see if government can manage it well, because I do think that tax is coming. That's going to be my guess. All right, still ahead. Yeah, it's the topic you've been waiting for. Yeah, we're going to talk about sex, sort of. Or we're going to talk about talking about sex. We'll make sense of that just ahead right here on Across the Aisle.
Look at you. You're at the top of your game. You're unstoppable. Nothing can throw you off track. Wait, is that your car? Uh-oh. Yeah, I saw that coming. That will throw you off track. You're looking at around 10 grand in fines, legal fees, and increased insurance rates. Let's try this again. Smart move. Because buzz driving is drunk driving.
Boy meets girl, boy likes girl. Boy gets that funny feeling. Is it love? Or is it potential harassment? I'm Mike Ferguson, and this is Across the Aisle. State Representative Holly Rader wants to expand the ways sex ed is taught in Missouri. Now, she doesn't really want to get rid of it or get rid of anything that's in place now. She wants to make discussions about consent and harassment part of that class, part of that curriculum. Is this just a matter of changing with the times, especially in light of the Me Too discussions and movement, or is this a knee-jerk reaction and government overreach into what parents should be doing? And Jessie, we're going to start with you. This gets real touchy anytime you talk about sex education, you talk about the public schools, you talk about a government mandate, but then you also talk about all the stories we've seen in the news, everything from recently in the Olympics, back to Rose McGowan, to Matt Lauer, all of these people involved on different sides of it. Should we be adding to sex education in our state?
Absolutely, hands down. Sexual education is something that's so important in society and things like that, and the issue is that it is taboo. People don't want to talk about it. Parents are embarrassed to speak to their kids about this thing. And for some, many of the things that they learn are from the public education system. And if it's not from your health class, it's from your friends or from the internet, which can actually give you falsehood information. The issue is that consent and harassment are both very pervasive in the community now, not because of the modern issues with the Me Too movement and all the sexual harassment things coming forward. It's because that conversation is no longer taboo. People are not afraid to talk about sexual harassment, assault, or consent, and that's just going to improve over time.
My guess is going to be consent, and Jessie, I'm going to come back to you on this question. My guess is going to be consent is something I think people across the aisle would cross the line, cross the spectrum, would say, okay, yeah, consent is absolutely something we need to have a standard for, have an understanding of. Harassment in some places, and even in some jurisdictions governmentally, you get asked out on a date, you say no thanks, he says no, I really like her, I want to ask her out again. That's harassment in some places. Who gets to decide what harassment is?
The person who gets to decide what harassment is the person who's being harassed. So the idea of consent has always been blurry from different generations to different ideas and things like that, and it's mostly common sense. You can tell when someone's attracted to you and someone's actually furthering that campaign of yours, but if they're not into it, it's just let things go. And so you don't cross into that border. If you're making someone uncomfortable, that's your own personal fault and things like that, but it's also a communication issue. You can clearly understand if someone says no thank you and they walk away, don't chase them, don't continue to catcall them, don't harass them on social media and things like that. I feel like it's very common sense, and the issue is if it's not, it needs to be educated about, and that's why it needs to be in these public schools.
Now, Chris, I'm not going to give away our age here, but when we were in high school and college, we were told, don't give up on her. Yeah. Keep asking. She may go out with you on a date, and she may end up liking you. So is this a generational difference that we've got here?
I think it is, and on the forefront, because sexual harassment and all of that, Me Too, is becoming more prevalent, I think it should be incorporated into sex education. But then my conservative mind makes me a little suspicious, because I know that college professors and teachers normally sway towards the liberal bent, and I'm afraid that they may be indoctrinating young women and young men into different societal norms that we have, where automatically a boy may be scared to talk to a girl because they've been indoctrinated with that. So that's what worries me on the forefront. I'm afraid of indoctrination.
Let's look at a historical perspective. And so we happen to have the luxury of a history professor right here, not just politics, but culturally. Things that were taboo in the 50s became less taboo or not taboo in the 60s. Things that were still taboo in the 70s, maybe not in the 80s. Things that were still taboo in the 90s, different now. Does Chris have a point saying there could be mission creep for a lot of people when it comes to standards and morals and gender roles even?
I'm not so much concerned about mission creep, although I think there's always a possibility of that. But what you have is blurriness. Okay, in the 50s, harassment, what we would call harassment today, was harassment then, but nobody talked about it. Okay, in the 60s, you still had harassment, but now because of more open, and I may be a third generation here for all I know. I'm not quite sure about our age differences, so I grew up in the 60s, and the ideas were a little bit more blurred about what was acceptable and when, and that got even worse in the 70s. Okay, now it started to kind of right itself to some degree in the 80s, but to a degree. Okay, and we never quite figured this sucker out. I think the Me Too movement now is kind of forcing us to figure this out. Okay, and it's a discussion we should have had 30 years ago. actually we should have had a lot longer than that, but at least 30 years ago when you know, as women became much more prominent in society and much more significant political players. Okay, but you know, I can speak about the women I knew back in the 80s and in the 70s. Many of them just put up with this stuff, and they dealt with it, and they dealt with it, many of them with a degree of aplomb that I don't think most men would have. Most of us would have not handled it nearly as well. So, yeah, I understand where you're getting at, but I don't think that's the concern. And of course, and if I don't know if you guys have daughters. I have one.
I do. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of when you think
about their age, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, so is mine. And so it's one of those cases you go, you know, what do you put up with?
Well, let me. Yeah, good, Chris.
I'm just worried that you know, some little boy in 5th and 6th grade is be subtly told, you know, you're naturally a predator and you can't help it because you've got testosterone, and incorporating that in their minds and making women maybe feel like they're victims and you got to watch out for boys because we can't help ourselves. That's what I'm just worried about, because you see that in the broader culture where they're trying to say that about men and women.
Okay, let me put you on the spot here, Skyler. Is that could there be a backlash to the point where right now we're seeing even some cases where just an accusation destroys a career, destroys a life? Can this go too far in the name of trying to do the right thing?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think this is a slippery slope. Like we were just talking about, it's a difficult situation. You have people who consider sexual harassment to be a variety of different things. And at the end of the day, I think this comes down to something much broader, which is this idea of respect. If schools are going to start taking over and talking about consent and sexual harassment, I think that they're making up for something that maybe isn't being discussed at home. This idea of respect for authority, respect for other people. And it's difficult to actually say when asking a girl out becomes too much. But I think there are certain clear-cut lines as far as unwanted touching, anything like that, somebody maybe overstepping their bounds. As for what we just discussed, you know, as we were saying about, you know, young kids talking to girls, being worried about that, we definitely don't want to phase that out of our culture.
Okay, we started with you, Jessie. You get the last word on this one.
I definitely think it is a generational issue, but not in the case that people are afraid to ask girls out and things like that, because that's still a common thing in our society. It's the idea that it was taboo because women were not allowed to speak forward about it. When they did, we saw with multiple women, when they did come forward, they were shamed by their families. They were saying, well, you should have appreciated that kind of thing. And if they complained about sexual advances, they were labeled as prude and things like that. I agree, it's a human issue. It's not just women and men, because both are sexually assaulted and harassed, and they both need to learn about consent. But that's why public schools need to have this borderline and the basis for it, so people actually understand what consent is. It's a very clear line if you go in to discuss it. And the thing is that if we had these laid out general guidelines for everyone, everyone would at least be informed, and there would be no, I didn't know this was wrong, or I didn't think she didn't want this kind of thing. It's always the matter of who you're approaching, what their feelings are about it.
And with that, we're going to wrap up the discussion, because we know that in another 10 or 15 or 20 years, the next generation is going to have probably, unfortunately, this same debate with a whole different set of parameters. On behalf of Lindenwood University Television, thank you to Chris, thank you to Dr. Heidenreich, thank you to Jessie, thank you to Skyler. I'm Mike Ferguson, and we'll see you next week right here on Across the Aisle.